All right, we're going to try and make sense of a crisis that has pushed, well, an entire population and really the world's conscience right to the brink. We're talking about Gaza as of August 2025. It's a story about unimaginable human suffering, a really deep history, and a conflict that's, well, it's testing the very foundations of our global order. So let's get into it.
To really grasp the urgency here, you just have to look at this quote. It's from a report by the World Food Program and UNICEF. They're basically saying the debate is over, waiting around for some kind of official famine declaration when people are already starving to death. They call it unconscionable. It's a powerful word. The message is clear. The catastrophe isn't on the horizon. It's here, right now.
And this number really shows you who's paying the steepest price. 320,000. Just let that sink in. That's how many kids, children under 5 years old, are at risk of acute malnutrition. And that's the deadliest form of starvation. We're talking about an entire generation that is literally on the verge of being lost.
So let's start by looking at what's actually happening on the ground right now. UN agencies are using some really stark language. They're describing Gaza as being in a state of complete system collapse, a spiral of humanitarian catastrophe. It's pretty grim.
Okay, so look at these numbers. The sheer scale of the hunger is just staggering. You see that 25%? That's the part of the population in what experts call famine-like conditions. But then look at the other part. 75% are at emergency hunger levels. So what does that actually mean? Well, if you add it up, it means that literally 100%, everyone in Gaza is facing a life-threatening shortage of food. Nobody is safe from this.
And, it's not just about food. It goes so much deeper. The basic systems that keep people alive, they've just collapsed. We're talking about massive shortages of clean water, fuel for generators, medicine. Hospitals are completely overwhelmed, and a lot of them just aren't functioning at all. This is exactly why you hear the UN using a phrase as horrifying as a graveyard for children. Because when there's no clean water and only, 15% of nutrition services are still working, disease just spreads like wildfire. It's a perfect storm.
So the big question is, how? How did things get this bad? A level of devastation like this, it doesn't just happen overnight. It's the product of a long and very violent cycle. So to really understand the now, we have to go back and look at the then.
Okay. There are really 3 key dates you have to know to get the basic landscape here. Think of them as historical signposts. First, 1948. This is the year the State of Israel was founded, which also led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, creating the refugee crisis. Then you have 1967, the Six-Day War. That's when Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip begins. And finally, 2007. This was a huge turning point. Hamas takes full control of Gaza, and in response, Israel and Egypt impose a blockade that has basically sealed it off from the world ever since.
Now, to really get a handle on the cycle of violence that came next, you need to hear about this phrase. It's reportedly being used by some in Israeli military circles, mowing the grass. It's a pretty cynical term, right? And the idea behind it is you're not trying to solve the problem permanently. You're not trying to find a political solution. You're just managing it. Every few years, you go in and militarily degrade Hamas's capabilities, knowing full well that, just like grass, it's going to grow back. This mindset, it really explains the whole pattern of these recurring wars.
And right here, you can see the results of that mowing the grass strategy in stark numbers. Just look at the pattern. You have the war in 2008-2009, then the one in 2014, the crisis in 2021. Now, look at the column for the current war. The scale of casualties for both Palestinians and Israelis, it hasn't just increased, it has absolutely exploded. Each cycle of this conflict has become exponentially deadlier.
Okay, so that brings us to the current war. What made this one so different, so much more devastating? Well, it all started with an incredible act of deception on one side and a catastrophic intelligence failure on the other.
So according to reporting from places like Reuters, the October 7th attack wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment thing. Not at all. It was the final move in a deception campaign that went on for years. Hamas spent all this time making it look like they were more interested in, governing and economic issues. They essentially lulled Israeli intelligence into a false sense of security.
And the whole time, they were secretly planning this massive, complex assault.
And this deception campaign led directly to what analysts like Peter Beaumont have called an intelligence failure for the ages. I mean, it was an epic failure. Hamas's operational security, what they call OBSEC, it was just airtight. Reports say that even when Israeli intelligence did pick up some unusual movements, they completely misjudged what they were seeing. They thought it was just a few small, separate training drills, not the run-up to a huge, coordinated invasion. And that miscalculation, that was the opening Hamas was waiting for.
So Israel's response, which they called Operation Iron Sword, has rolled out in a few distinct phases. First, there was this massive campaign of aerial bombardments all across the Gaza Strip. Then came Step 2, the ground invasion, which started up in the north. Step 3, that offensive was pushed all the way south, into the city of Rafah. But here's the thing, now we're seeing what looks like a fourth phase. Israeli forces are having to go back into parts of the north they thought they'd cleared because Hamas militants are regrouping. It just goes to show how incredibly difficult it is to achieve their stated goal of completely eliminating the group.
But a fire this big was never going to stay in one place. This conflict didn't stay inside Gaza's borders. The shockwaves have spread out, and they're now threatening to destabilize the entire region.
And here's a perfect example of that. Just look at the economic hit Egypt has taken because of the Houthi rebel attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. Attacks they say are in support of the Palestinians, global trade routes have been upended. For Egypt, this has crippled traffic through the Suez Canal, one of their biggest moneymakers. We're talking about a 40% drop in revenue year over year as of early 2025. That's a staggering blow.
And it's not just about economics either. The conflict has lit fuses all over the region. You've got near-constant cross-border fire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. You have the Houthi attacks we just mentioned. In 2024, we saw something truly unprecedented, direct missile strikes between Iran and Israel, plus dozens of attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria. And just as importantly, it's frozen diplomacy. Saudi Arabia, for instance, put its talks on normalizing relations with Israel on ice. The whole board has been reset.
Okay, so this brings us to the final and maybe the biggest piece of the puzzle. Let's zoom out. Because this isn't just a regional crisis anymore. It's become a major challenge to the whole idea of international law and a rules-based global order. This is where the war in Gaza becomes a crisis for all of us. And one of the biggest fault lines that is opened up on the global stage is this accusation of double standards. You hear it from the UN Secretary General, from leaders all across the global south. They look at the West's swift, unified response to the war in Ukraine, and then they look at the response to Gaza and they ask, why the difference? The Prime Minister of Ireland put it bluntly, saying he thinks they have a point. The fear is that if international law isn't applied the same way everywhere, it loses all its authority.
And this debate is now playing out in the world's highest courts. First, you have the International Court of Justice, or ICJ. You can think of it as the UN's top court for disputes between countries. South Africa brought a case there accusing Israel of violating the Genocide Convention. Now, a final ruling on that will take years, but the court did issue a preliminary order saying that the risk of genocide was plausible, and it ordered Israel to take immediate measures to prevent it. Just that word, plausible, sent shockwaves through the world of international law.
Then there's the other major court, the ICC, or the International Criminal Court. And here's the key difference. The ICC goes after individuals, not states. We're talking about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and its prosecutor has taken the absolutely explosive step of applying for arrest warrants for leaders on both sides of this conflict. That includes leaders of Hamas for the attacks on October 7th and top Israeli leaders for their conduct of the war, including the accusation of using starvation as a weapon of war. Suddenly, this makes the question of accountability very, very personal.
And this quote from a UN Special Rapporteur, Mary Lawler, I think it just perfectly captures the feeling of this moment. She said the international human rights architecture is creaking under the weight of the hypocrisy of states. She's pointing to this huge gap between countries talking about a rules-based order and what's actually being allowed to happen on the ground. The system, she's saying, is at a breaking point.
And all of this leaves us with one final and, I think, unavoidable question. This conflict has put so much more than just a region on trial. In a way, it feels like the very idea of international law is in the dock. So,
Can a rules-based order actually survive if its rules aren't applied equally to everyone, everywhere? That's the question, and the whole world is waiting to see the answer.